He is one of the most sought-after lecturers in Yad Vashem. He has, for over 2 decades, has led groups of Yad Vashem, inspiring, informing with the love that he has for Klaus. And indeed, he has written the last book he wrote called Heroic Children. And by the way, I've asked him to leave his books outside for those who peruse who wish to do so. He wrote a book called Heroic Children, the story of 9 children who survived. And the response to that book is unreal. I thought I would introduce him originally simply by reading a few words from Lord Jonathan Sachs. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, man of words, listen to these words about this book, Heroic Children, personifying our guest. We cannot change the past, but by remembering it, we can change the future. On no issue is this more vital than the Holocaust. Older also, since survivors are growing older and fewer, while anti-Semitism almost unbelievably has returned to the arena of global problems. This makes Rabbi Hanoch's masterpiece, Heroic Children, a necessary work as well as an outstanding one. It is an astonishing collection of stories about child survivors of the Shoah, each gripping narrative of courage, defiance, and hope, a flame lit by the human spirit in the darkest night history has ever known. A superb and unforgettable word. We are privileged this morning to have a distinct trust.
As the Shiva mentioned, you cannot acknowledge a fellow person. Tisha B'Av, you cannot acknowledge the Tanzer, the Friedman who worked so hard, the perpetual Shadchan Tisha College, Mervin. I'm going to begin. We're going to learn one kina from the Baba the Rebbe, composed at the very end, which addresses the plight of those who underwent the Holocaust. But before I do that, let me introduce this elegy of the Baba Rebbe with an anecdote about him himself. The Baba Rebbe relocated after the war after having lost his entire family. He came to Borough Park, Brooklyn, and there he commenced a rejuvenation. Baba Mostos now are all over the world. And the anecdote goes like this. One morning, the Baba Rebbe's house was being painted by a black painter. They're taking all the paintings off the wall, obviously. And one of the, I'm so sorry, this story happened to my friend Yassel Chapman, who lives in Borough Park, which is a religious neighborhood in Brooklyn. Yassel told me they were taking the paintings off the wall so the painter could paint. And one of the enlargements was a blow-up of the Baba Rebbe. And the black painter said to my friend Yassel, he said, "Is this your rabbi?" He said, "No." He said, "Why isn't he your rabbi?" "He's not my rabbi. Let's get on with the work." "But why isn't he your rabbi?" "He's not my rabbi. Could we get started already?" "But why he's not my rabbi? Look at the wall. There's so many rabbis, beard and face. He's very rabbinic looking. Now can we get on with it?" "But why isn't he? He's not my rabbi." And then the black painter said, "He's my rabbi." He said, "What though?" He pulled out his wallet, ripped out a photograph of the Baba Rebbe. So I'll tell you. One morning I was painting the house. The Rebbe came home. He said to me, "Did you have breakfast?" I said, "No." He said, "Sit down." He waited upon me, and then he said to me, "I want to tell you something. I knew just what he was going to say. I heard this schmooze a million times. He's going to tell me I'm paying you good money. I want a perfect job." But the Rebbe said, "We once had the world of perfection. We had our holy temple, and everything was the way it was supposed to be. But because of our sins, the temple was destroyed. So therefore, I cannot ask you to do a perfect job. I can only ask you to try your hardest. And you know how it is? People recommend. He gave me hundreds of his Hasidim. No one ever offered me breakfast. But they'll say to me, I'm paying you good money. I want the perfect job. And I say to them, you want a perfect job? There's no temple. How do you want a perfect job? So the Baba Rebbe writes an elegy, which we're going to learn together. Maybe the best thing would be is, Rabbi Friedman, if you handed it out, we can, it's going around.
It's going around. It should
I
be a
just want to
sheet.
set the tone, what we're going to say. We're going to read the words, we'll do this communally, and then I'm going to address just a few lines as a springboard to my topic.
The article Sidurim, it's on page 384 as well. 384. The art scroll Kinoto, 384.
This elegy captures so fully the raw sense of the loss, contracted, telescopically condensed. And if you look to just the fourth line, according to the Baba Rebbe, do not forget for all the generations. He's addressing the entire Jewish people. In other words, contemplating the events of the Holocaust is not an optional exercise for the select few. It's an obligation upon each and every member of our people. And before I continue, I want to try and make this as personal as I can. When I grew up, 27, when I grew up, we saw numbers engraved on the flesh everywhere. I wonder how many numbers my children have seen, if my grandchildren have seen any at all. In this regard, I want to relate 3 anecdotes. Erev Yom Kippur, the eve of Yom Kippur, is the most crowded day in the men mikvah. SRO, squeeze room only. And in my neighborhood in Jerusalem, which is a pretty devout neighborhood, the mikvah is so crowded and boisterous and noisy, and everybody's, it's all Yerushalmi, Jerusalemites and Hasidim, and everybody's talking very loudly in Yiddish. Very, very boisterous. And there was one kid from across the street, from the Or Sameach Yeshiva for beginners. How do I know from Or Sameach? It said on his t-shirt, Or Sameach wrestling. I'm just joking. He had an earring and a ponytail. Clearly he was not a chassid nor Yerushalmi. And this kid felt legitimately very much out of place in the mikvah. And the people in this mikvah are not especially subtle. About as subtle as heavy metal is subtle. And they're gawking and gaping. This poor kid is highly embarrassed. He places his palms over his biceps. Very apparent to me and to others that he had a tattoo that was not appropriate for the eve of Yom Kippur. I dare say not appropriate for Gans or Freilich, but certainly not the eve of Yom Kippur. And everyone's gawking at this poor kid who's highly embarrassed, about to step into the pool, and then slips and trips, and there's this roaring silence in the mikvah. Sphinx-like silence. Picture a forest after trees felled. If this means anything to you, the mighty Mudville Same after mighty Casey struck out. There wasn't a sound. Before it's as if we went deaf, and now it's as if we went deaf. You could hear heartbeats. No one was moving. Everyone was frozen. Now these lewd and gaudy tattoos were flying through the air. These were not anchors. It was the most inappropriate tattoo I don't even want you to imagine. In my life, I have never, ever witnessed such embarrassment. The kids are in alabaster, and I saw him cogitating he'll jump in, he'll never come out. He died 1,000 deaths. No one was moving, you could hear heartbeats, and just then, an elderly neighbor of mine, this story took place 21 years ago. I can still hear in my ears the thwack, 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 as this elderly neighbor walked across the moist marble floor and went over to this kid who was more dead than alive and said to him in this heavily Yiddishy, European accent in English, "Don't hold young man. I also have a tattoo." Pointing to numbers going up his flesh. In other words, you went through your Ganem, and I went through my Ganem. Let's begin Yom Kippur together. Kid came back to life. Spontaneously, everyone over wished him a good yar, a Shana Tova. I saw one small thing can make all the difference in the world. Second story, I have a friend in New York. He's actually more a friend of a friend. A psychiatrist named Ike Hirschkopf. He wrote a book on depression entitled Hello Darkness, My Old Friend. And Ike Hirschkopf grew up in the Breuers community in Washington Heights. This might be equivalent to the Glen Hazel of Manhattan, or better yet, time-wise, the Oval of Manhattan. And in that community, you saw a lot of numbers. And in the summer, they would vacation the Rockaways, and of course, in the bathing suits, there were numbers everywhere. So much so that when he was 9 years old, he asked his mother, "When will I get my numbers?" Which caused her to run out of the kitchen crying. Ike Hirschkopf's uncle was a physician in the Catskill Mountains, and his aunt, the doctor's wife, was a doctor's assistant. And she called him up one day and she said, "Ike, this Sunday Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is coming to the clinic. Would you like to see him?" What kid who grew up in Washington Heights in the 50s wouldn't give the right arm to meet Moshe Feinstein? He said, "Of course." He scrubbed his face, put on his yontif finery. He got early to the waiting room and he held his safe and he looked as religious as he possibly could. Hayya, 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 hayya. And the waiting room got more and more full, and more crowded, and more and more and more. And finally, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein walked in with his entourage. And right away, the aunt went over to him. And he said, "Rabbi Feinstein, I'm very sorry, but there's a lot of people here. You're going to have to wait your turn." And she planted a kiss on both cheeks. And Ike Hirschkopf melted into the floorboards. When he could finally emerge, he crawled over, and in his halting Yiddish, he said, "Entschuldigung, my tante, sie weiß nicht, the floor. I'm so sorry. Rabbi Feinstein, my aunt, she's not a religious woman. She doesn't know any better." And Moshe said, "Shh. She has the numbers. She's holier than I." And lastly, he asked the Satmar Rebbe, "Where should we go in this day and age to acquire a blessing?" He said, "Go to Shoah. You see the men putting on their tefillin. You see the numbers engraved on their flesh. You know that's their affidavit to Shemayim. Those are the people you can ask a blessing from." So he continues, the Rebbe, "Za'akasam chiosehem spufim skurim bakronim katzon latebach yivalu masreifa bakif shonim." Remember their screaming, their weeping, as they were tightly packed into cattle cars. Let me just stop for a moment, for you can ask the question, and I've heard this question asked many a time. Why is it that on Tisha B'Av we also talk about always the Holocaust. It was, and it's in the past. And you can ask the very same question. Why talk about the Churban HaBayis, destruction of the temple? It was, and it's in the past. And you'll find this very same question in the current Mizrahi magazine, written by my colleague, Rabbi Ruvain Tarragon. We worked together in Shivat HaKotel. The way to answer this question is the story of the Baal Shem Tov. It was said about the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the Hasidic movement, that he could go to a particular spot in the forest and recite a specific formula and an angel would appear. One generation later, they knew the forest and they knew that specific spot, but they did not know that particular formula, and an angel did not appear. One generation later, they knew where the forest was, but they didn't know that specific space, nor did they know the particular formula, and an angel did not appear. And we, so many generations removed, we don't even know where the forest is, certainly not the formula. What do we have in the grandeur and the majesty of the Baal Shem Tov? And the answer is, we have everything. But we have the story, and that brings us back. So the Rebbe continues. Remember their screaming, their weeping as they were tightly packed and locked into the train's cattle cars. Like sheep to the slaughter, they were led to be incinerated in crematorium ovens. And this expression requires a lot of elucidation. Like sheep to the slaughter. Insofar as they were helpless, having been lulled into the cattle cars at gunpoint, believing they're going to be reunited with their families and work in the harvest. The Nazis were geniuses, and always making the worst worse. No one could fathom anything that could be worse than the ghetto. And they thought they're going to be sent to the harvest. Because that's the way the mind works. The Nile is not just a river in Egypt. You want to think things are going to be better. And they knew in the Warsaw Ghetto that there were Jews still hiding. So they had people at gunpoint going into the gas chamber writing home postcards. Dear Beryl, Shmerel, Errol, and Chatzkel, things are wonderful here. We can't wait to see you. The food is intriguing. The classes are great. Love, Bubby. And these postcards were postmarked from the most idyllic locations in Europe. And you get a letter from someone you recognize, telling you things are going to be better. As before, the Nile is not just a river in Egypt. Who are these victims? They've been stripped of their citizenship, eliminated from schools and employment, deprived of all their income, deprived of their assets, taken away, stripped from them all means of transportation and communication, and forced to wear yellow badges. For a large number, their plight was immediate deportation to the killing fields. Subjected to squalor, subject to disease, brutality, and humiliation. If they managed to live through the ghetto, they were then sent to the extermination camps through exquisite subterfuge. The Nazis preyed upon the Jews' innocence, their wishful thinking, employing very sophisticated deception, manipulation of language, verbal camouflage. They referred to the camps as the East. The last words the Jews heard were, Ivan, turn on the water. Their fears of the unknown were greatly relieved by these postcards. They were whipped into the final deception, the gas chambers, disguised as showers. Who could conceive to seeing their synagogues burned, their rabbis humiliated, suffering such destruction? Who could conceive of such unspeakable horror? Not innocent, tyrannized people who were depleted after everything they'd already endured. The very monstrosity of the crime made it, in a word, unbelievable. And the Rebbe says, Nakom nikmas dam anashim. Taf anashim. Revenge the children and the women. I want you to know that historically it is a fact we lost 1/3 of our people. 6 million was 1/3. Contemporary research is closer to 7 million. That's 1/3. But from a Torah perspective, it is not a reflective number. At the time of the Holocaust, there were 3 Mesivta high schools in America, 3 Torah high schools that were very poorly attended. There wasn't one kollel. There wasn't one girls' school. The number of boys that were learning at a yeshiva level in Israel was under 500. The very heart and soul of Torah Judaism was in Lithuania, White Russia, Hungary, Poland, Romania. That was not decimated, that was annihilated. Over 95%. And look around. Look around. It's unbelievable. Is this not the greatest Nakom? The rejuvenation has never been paralleled in history. So, before we begin the story, I sort of want to start at the beginning. It's going to make it more historically neater and time-wise tenable. I'm going to focus on 3 events, 2 of them from 1938. In 1938, there were 3 seminal events, beginning with the Anschluss in March 1938. Hitler believed 2 countries which speak the same language should have the same flag. There was a referendum, and 99.7% of the Austrians voted. They want to be under Nazi dominion. What happened to the 250,000 Jews? Forgot to vote that day. Very democratic elections. I was born in Austria, and I was told that the people were upset. I'm a senior tour guide in Yad Vashem. There's film strips of the Austrians literally jumping for joy, greeting Hitler's arrival. Upset they were. And whereas in Germany, from 1930, you could do whatever you wish to a Jew. Pillage, plunder, rape, murder, and have the total protection, and have no recourse to go to the police. The poor Austrians, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, to March of 38, and then it was like a pressure cooker where the lid flew off. The old men and women forced to clean the streets. And the policemen had their arms folded. So finally, Jews are doing something productive and not just counting their money. The children are forced into the icy river to try and get out. Bricks are thrown at their heads. And all this is a year and a half before the war begins. And these pictures are conveyed to the West. Pictures, videos, stills. And there's agitation in America to do something. The President of the United States, named after the highway in Manhattan, FDR, was not especially concerned. But the cabinet was concerned about the plight of one Austrian Jew. The plight, the suffering, and the arrest of one Austrian Jew. And that was, he was Dr. Sigmund Freud. And the way the mind works, it's funny to say the mind when you're talking about Freud. The way the mind works, it's easy to think about 1 over 250,000. It's easy to think about the story of Anne Frank over 6 million. It's easy to think about 6 million paper clips or paper clips over 6 million souls. So the cabinet was agitated, and the president, who was a sophisticated public relations expert, decided he's going to do something that will make a lot of noise and accomplish nothing. So the United States convened the Avion Conference on Lake Geneva in France, the border of France and Switzerland. In the first 2 days, France and America bicker who's going to chair this conference, for they knew it would be a fiasco. 33 countries are invited from the get-go. They are sending an invitation. No one is expected to change their quota. The Jews in Austria and Germany look upon this conference as their hope to get out. They desperately need to. And every country gets up and describes what they're not going to do. Australia gets up Australia today in 2018 is 95% barren. And Australia says, we don't have any room for the Jews. New Zealand says more or less the same. Argentina says, we've taken more than America. That was true. France says, we've taken more than the world. That was true. Heinrich Rothmann, the rapid vitriolic anti-Semitic border patrol of Switzerland says, we have as much need for the Jews as the Germans do. And it was he who came up with the idea of putting a J on the passport. There was an open border between Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. Like there's an open border between America and Canada. But to make sure Jews didn't come in, he identified them with a J. What came out of this conference? Hitler understood that now he can do whatever he wishes, and the world wouldn't give a flying flip. A reporter for the Herald Tribune wrote that Avion backwards spells naive. The Jews looked upon it as to be their salvation, and it turned out to be the death knell. Hitler announced afterwards, I don't care if you take these criminals on first-class liners, but just take them. But no one was moving. On the face of the earth, there wasn't a single haven for Jews. And that brings us to the story the very same year of the SS St. Louis, the most famous, perhaps infamous, of doomed ships. On board are 937 Jewish passengers, obviously wealthy German Jews that paid a fortune. So much money to acquire paperwork to go to Cuba. And the boat docks in Havana, Cuba. It docks at the port, it's tethered to the shore, and you can look up and see the passengers. At that point, the Cubans want a bride. Now in Latin America, South America, Central America, a bride is a way of life. I'll bet you that the first word you learn in Spanish is el braigo. So if they want the bride, what should you do? Let's try that again. Nearly 1,000 Jews. And of these 937 Jews, 736 have legitimate American visas, but they'll only be valid in 3 months' time. They need a bride. What should you do? Obviously give them the bride. But the leader of American Jewry, his name was Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, whom we used to call Hagoy Hagadol Hazeh. Rabbi Wise was the quintessential Reform rabbi. Good crop of hair, well-built, stage presence, rhetorical abilities, cushy at FDR, Eleanor members of the cabinet. A bribe's against the law. You can't violate the law. And the irony of ironies was that somehow they made it into Cuba. It required millions of dollars to be housed and educated. They would have come up with the money, but not to violate the law. The captain of the ship, Gustav Schroeder, a German, was a benevolent humanitarian. He figures 736 have American visas. America's a humane country. He steams his ship up and down the eastern seaboard. How does America greet the boat? With a Coast Guard cutter to intercept. Had somehow they jumped off and swam the 20 miles to Miami, had it been doable, they would have been returned. And this boat that was tethered in the west, not a country will accept them. To go back to where they came from, the majority perish. I move up now to the end of the war. I don't know if any of you have ever heard the Musi negotiations. If you haven't, I can recommend a book or two by Hanoch Teller. On the table were the 800,000 Jews still left alive in the camps. Jean-Marie Musi was the former Swiss president, a chum of Himmler, Nazi sympathizer, but during the war, his perspective changed. At this point, the Bad Hatzalah, not to be confused with the ambulance corps, the Gedolim of America, Rabbi Aaron Cutler, Rabbi Lazer Silver, Rabbi Avram Kalmanovich, Rabbi Yosheber Soloveitchik, and important Balabatim, Irving Bunim, Mike Tress, Louis Septimus, Stephen S. Klein, and others worked around the clock, undermanned, understaffed, underfinanced, to do what they could to save the Jews in Europe. Himmler demanded the Van Hatzela, working with the Von Cutler, working together in tandem with the Sternbach family in Switzerland, who used the office, Jean-Marie Moussi, wanted to negotiate. And Himmler was much more practical than Hitler. He wanted to save his neck. And he was the top cop. He was afraid that all the guards in the concentration camps would be deemed war criminals and shot on the spot. He wanted them to have the status of POWs. So they negotiated. At first he wanted medicine and trucks. The Von Hatzela could not come up with this. So he changed his demand to 5 million Swiss francs, about the equivalent of $1 million. Now I'm aware of the fact that $1 million today is not what it was then, but $1 million. That would have been the cheapest rescue in the history of history. Borscht Billig. But the Von Hatzela didn't have $1 million. So Rav Aaron Cutler who looked like the classic Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva, long black coat, stooped, gray beard, for all I know, a little dandruff, holding the Holy Svarim. By looking at him, you couldn't tell how clever he was. He did not converse in English. He spoke Yiddish. So Irving Bunim, the head of Young Israel, is his translator. They go before the joint which has $1 million. And Aaron Cutler insists that they give this $1 million to save these 800,000 Jews still alive in the camps. And the joint says, no way. We can't do it. Because it violates the British blockade, which is sacrosanct. And it's after Pearl Harbor. This means trading with the enemy. That's a felonious crime. And for all I know, it's a treasonous crime. To the Gedolim of America, to the great rabbis of America, it is despicable to give money to the Nazis. It is odious to violate American law. And yet, there's a higher law. And the higher law is Pikuach Nefesh, to save a life. And the higher law is Pidyon Shvuyim, to rescue a captive. And the higher law is Arvut, responsibility, one Jew towards his brother. So Irving Bunim, at the behest of Aaron Cutler, argues, please, give us this $1 million, let us save these lives. 800,000 lives. And the joint will not give in. In desperation, Aaron Cutler tells Bunim, tell him, you are worthless. You are meaningless. You have to give this money. And finally they say, okay, we'll give you this money, provided you get a license from the American government. We can give $1 million to the Nazi enemy. There's only one person in all of America who will be authorized to give this money, and that, of course, was the president, FDR. I want you to know that American Jewry was intoxicated, farshikir over FDR. I have some pictures of New York Jewry learning of his passing, with tears cascading down their cheeks. You ask a Jew in the 30s who was a leader, they respond in Yiddish, in the drei Welten. The word for world English is Welt. The drei Welten, there's 3 worlds. Der Welt, jener Welt, and the Rosa Welt. In the very same breath as the world to come. The man who decided determinedly to be of no assistance. So Rabbi Aaron Cutler with the raging fever travels to Washington with Irving Bunim as his translator. They go to the White House, and apparently the president felt that the plight of 800,000 Jews was not important enough for his time. He sends him to his hyper-assimilated Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. And you can imagine, being a secretary in FDR's cabinet, you had to be an extremely assimilated Jew, which he was. And there is no way he's going to authorize $1 million of taxpayer money to go to the Nazi enemy. And he refuses. And Bunim tries and he tries in desperation. Ron tells him, tell him, you are worthless and you are meaningless. if you can't save the life of one child in Europe. There is no way in the world Irving Bunim is going to tell the Secretary of the Treasury in the White House, you are worthless and Washington is meaningless. And he gives him a milquetoast version. The rabbi is very disappointed. We hope in the future you can be of greater help. Now, Rabbi Cutler does not understand English, but as I like to joke, he was an observant Jew. And he notices from Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s expression that what he had said had not been accurately translated. He said, Bunim, tell him precisely what I told you. At that point, Irving Bunim, not about to violate the dictates of the Gadol Hador, the most outstanding rabbi of the generation, looks down at his shoes to see if his socks are pulled up, his laces are tied, and other matters of sartorial concern. He says in a barely audible tone, Mr. Secretary, the rabbis asked me to inform you that you are worthless and Washington is meaningless. At that point, Henry Morgenthau Jr. collapses on the table like this for what appears to be eternity. When he finally raises his head, his eyes are deltas of red, the tears streaming down. He said, tell the rabbi, not forgotten who I am. And I'm going to put my neck on the chopping block to save my brethren. This would have been the greatest rescue effort in the history of history. But an American jury intervened, a Swiss jury scuttled it, and Hitler himself intervened. But Henry Morgenthau Jr. will always be remembered as one who was willing to risk his career on behalf of his brethren. And that's a very important take-home message from today, from this event. Because in life we have to make decisions. If we make the difficult decision, this is the way you'll be remembered. Think about what the rabbi did in his community. It wasn't easy. Or you can make the easy decision, this is the way you'll be forgotten. One more example that you know much better, and that's the story of Oskar Schindler. Schindler was a dishonest businessman, a womanizer. He wrote the book on dysfunctional marriage. A very checkered past. And at that critical time, he saved nearly 1,200 Jews during the Holocaust. Had it not been for the latter, if he'd be remembered, and that's a major if, he'd be remembered as a creep. And now the name Schindler is synonymous with heroism, bravery, courage, self-sacrifice, synonymous. Like Vaseline means petroleum jelly, and Kleenex means tissues, and Q-tips means cotton swabs, Schindler means self-sacrifice. He changed his name, and we can too. And the Rebbe writes that they went like sheep to the slaughter. Often this is used as a denigration, that they offered no resistance. I've already tried to explain who were they to resist. Misled, starved, humiliated. But the people ask, why didn't they fight back? It means you know zilch show about the Holocaust. If you were in a labor battalion of 10, and one escaped, what happened to the other 9? They are murdered. If you escape the ghetto to join the partisans, easily 1,000 innocent Jews can be annihilated, mowed right down. This creates tremendous Musar questions. How can you fight back if, as a consequence of your resistance, innocent people will be murdered? So we're going to have to redefine resistance as remaining human in inhuman circumstances. The Jews were subjected to what's called in psychology excremental assault. Jews suffered from, of course, we know, the famous diseases, tuberculosis, spotted fever, typhus, typhoid. Everyone suffered from Shigella, horrific bacillary dysentery, constant diarrhea, which racked the body. And a man cannot control his bowels. But you weren't allowed to relieve yourself when you wished. Start again, stop again. And far be it from me in a shul to We don't need to hear this for me to describe it, but I will just hint. They always would make a Rosh Hashiva, one with a long beard. They put a dunce cap on his head. And he was called, pardon the expression, the Scheissmeister, with a large clock around his neck. And they had to go into the latrine when they would instruct him to blow the whistle. And as they would try and get in to go to relieve themselves, then he'd be instructed to blow the whistle for those inside to come out. And everybody would roll on top of each other in all the muck. No one got to relieve themselves, and the Germans would be doubled over in laughter. Where they subjected us to what's called the logic of destruction. You're missing a button from your uniform, from your pajama. For this you'll be murdered. But you don't have a button to sew on, nor a needle, nor a thread. If you have a louse on the body, and they put their hands on their arms, there'd be a handful of lice that would chew them alive. But you violated orders. But there's nothing you can do about it. This fiction of keeping order. Where was the resistance? Okay. In Yad Vashem, many have probably seen this. There is a children's memorial. Thanks to the genius of the architect, the room was as black can be. You see the reflection of what appeared to be a million candles. There's a gentleman from Beverly Hills, Spiegel, who gave the money for this. And it's a delicious irony. It's 5 candles, really, but you see the reflection. Spiegel means in German and Yiddish, a mirror. And you hear names in Yiddish and in Hebrew and English till you run and run out. 1.5 million children who perished. And an insight from Rabbi Beryl Wine. The one name you don't hear is your own. If you are of Ashkenazic ancestry, it's pretty much the case over here. The only reason we're here is thanks to a miracle to our grandparents, great-grandparents. And I think about this every single day, or at least once a week. Moshe Rabbeinu had many beautiful names: Avigdor, Tuvia, Yedidia, and yet he's always known as Moshe. Kiminamayim Mishisu. He was drawn forth from the water. And he had that visage before his eyes. He always could have been alligator fodder at the bottom of the river. But he said to do something significant on his behalf and on behalf of his people. And that's commitment we renew afresh at Tisha B'Av. I want to conclude by telling you, as the Rabbi Ludi wrote a book, and I want to mention something, the idea behind the book. I'm a senior docent in Yad Vashem. And obviously when the war was over, people wanted to tell their stories and how they had suffered. But there's one story which went untold, was the story of the children. And it occurred to me there's a desperate race for time. These people are in the grip of old age. So I traveled around the world, including to Johannesburg. One of my children was a woman from Johannesburg who passed away 2 years ago. And I heard their stories. And made sure that they were accurate. And through this book, we tell the story of the Holocaust through the voices of 9 children. From every corner of the Holocaust kingdom, religious, non-religious, be it from Croatia, North Africa, from every section. And we worked on this book for 14 years. It was a lot of work. We finally have to go to press and make a deadline. And we neglected to do something that is embarrassingly, it's important and embarrassingly, we neglected, and that is, we didn't yet have a cover for the book. And the cover of the book is a very important component. I always say, those who say they don't judge a book by its cover, I know they never tried to sell a book. So we didn't have a cover, so we put the team on it. That means the children. And we're going through all the archives. And I don't know if you can see this book. It's right outside the door. I don't know if you can see the cover from a distance. But this is a very dramatic picture that was shot. And then Auschwitz was liberated. It's many, many, many children. This is just a zoom in. And we found the picture we're going to press in 3 days. So the copyright holder is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. I send off a request. You have to fill out an affidavit. You're not going to make any changes to the picture. And I wrote in the affidavit, I'm going to make this change and this change and that change and this change and that change and this change and this change. I'm going to Zoom. And the next day, I get permission. But they say you'll only get it high resolution in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I don't know if I had 3 days. And everyone knows that to turn a picture from high resolution to low resolution takes 10 seconds, not 3 weeks. But the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is a very large bureaucracy. Hundreds of employees, and that's the way they operate. But you'll pardon me for being an Israeli. I thought what was indicated was protexia, the right connections. And I have a friend in Baltimore, a very powerful Jew. They say that in his cell phone he has the private number of every senator and congressman in Baltimore and Washington are adjacent. And I figured, he's got to have a connection to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's right down the block. And his kid was living in yeshiva adjacent to my house in Jerusalem. So I run to the yeshiva and I said, Aryeh, thinking that this is a rhetorical question, Aryeh, is your father connected to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington? And he said, no. Disenchanted, crestfallen, melancholy, I walk out of the room. As I'm about to walk out, he says, but my mother is on the board. He's going to wring his neck. His mother is a judge, Chaya Friedman. I race off an email. I say, Chaya, I desperately need this picture. It's this lot number, this tag number, and I need it today. The next morning, I had the picture. And then it occurred to me, Let me ask you a question. What is the most famous story of the Holocaust? It's not a hard question. The most famous story. Anne Frank, of course. Now, Anne's story is not a reflective story. She wasn't in the ghettos, wasn't in the camps. She had a roof over her head, a modicum of food with her family. But because it's a story, it's easier to relate. So my methodology in the Holocaust is always to highlight the individual. The way the curators created the museum, Yad Vashem, was made to be guided. And at any time there are dozens of tours, and it fits my brain. These guides are unspooling data about an infinite crime that the head cannot absorb. So what I'm always doing is telling a personal story, a private story, to better connect, and through that, that's the vehicle that we tell the story of the Holocaust. So I wanted, again, I don't know if you can see in the distance, in this picture I wanted to highlight one child and color it. The picture is sepia, one child to highlight the story of an individual, not just a mass of numbers. And I had not requested permission for this. So once again, I turned to Chaya Friedman, Judge Friedman, who's on the board. I said, Chaya, I desperately need your help. We're going to press. Get me permission that I can color. I need permission for this. Get me permission to color one of the children. And she writes me back, I'm in the middle of convening a murder trial. I don't have time. So I wrote her, Chaya, this is killing me. And so she prevailed. I prevailed, she prevailed. And she writes me back, yes, yay, yay, nay, nay. I made the request, but I cannot assure you that they will acquiesce. And I think to myself, come on. This is the Holocaust. It's apple pie. It's mom. Who is going to refuse this? I'm going to use with you the technical term. We had what's called, in the industry, a press queue. At 10 o'clock that night, we're going to go to press. We'd already burned the plates. They were on the drums. And at 10 o'clock is our press queue. Now, if you have a press queue and you miss it, you have to pay for it anyways. And you don't get online the next day. You have to start on the queue all over again. You have to wait weeks. This is the largest press in Israel, arguably in the Middle East. But I wasn't concerned. But 3 hours before the press queue, or to be accurate, 2 hours and 48 minutes before press queue, I get a letter from the head archivist of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dear Rabbi Teller, We regret to inform you, you may not use the picture. If you wish to use the picture in its pristine state, without zooming or any alterations, you may. But once you make the slightest alteration, including coloring this boy, you may not. And this boy recently spoke out. He's sensitive, and our legal department said unequivocally, you may not use this picture with the coloration. What am I going to do? I got the plates on the drums. We're about to go to press. But I'm not such a pushover, a little bit of a fighter. So I sent off an email. I said, please tell me his name and his phone number. I'd like to speak with him. 1 hour and 54 minutes for a press queue. She writes back, we don't know his name, nor do we know where he lives. I said, but you just said he's sensitive and he spoke out. What do you mean? 42 minutes for a press queue. She sends me an online article on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. 4 people in this picture went back. These are people in the grips of old age, pointing to themselves as youngsters in this picture. It was apparent from this article, I use the yeshivish term, it was mashma from the article that this boy's name is Hirsch, but it wasn't clear. It seemed that way. And I didn't know if Hirsch was the first name or the last name. It's a common first and last name. And if he was Hirsch, he lives in Europe. Shrek I have now 32 minutes to find maybe Hirsch in Europe. So right away I eliminated England and Russia and Israel, that's Eurasia. And for good measure I took out Monaco and Liechtenstein. I'm left with 43 countries. So Storyteller is thinking, where am I going to find this boy in Europe today? So if you look at the picture, the kid looks pretty good. So I knew he couldn't be a Pole. A Pole could never look this good. It would have to be Hungarian. Hungary was invaded March 1944. To be in this shape, he'd have to be Hungarian. So Storyteller is thinking, where in the world would a Hungarian survivor of Auschwitz live in Europe today? And I concluded it'd have to be either Belgium or Switzerland. And I have a very clever friend in Switzerland, Moshe Loser, who works for IBM. What a shidduch. So 19 minutes to press queue, I call Moshe Loser, you gotta find me maybe Hirsch. He said, is maybe his first name or his last name? I said, I don't know. He said, Hanoch, what were you drinking? I said, I wasn't drinking anything. I don't have time, I gotta find him. He said, is he religious? I don't know. I said, you know, if you give me his name, first name, last name, I have IBM at my disposal. I'll find him for you. I don't know. I said, you know what? I'll bet you he's Hungarian. Try Gavor or Tibor Hirsch. That would be the equivalent of Gavin or Brian Hirsch in South Africa. So here I'm clicking in the computer. Gavor Hirsch tells me 89-year-old engineer. Here's his phone number. For 6 minutes to press queue, I call him up. In my Hochdeutsch, I request his permission, which he gives me. I have at home a beautiful picture of Gabor holding this book in Switzerland. And I fire off an email to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, to that archivist. It's 3 minutes to press queue. And I say, I have permission. If you have any questions, here's his phone number, but it's already 9 o'clock in Switzerland. I don't think he's an elderly gentleman. I don't think you should disturb him. And I want you to know, it would have been harder for me to parallel park than to get this guy's permission with one shot. I took that as an omen that we have to retell the stories. We have to retell these stories on Tisha B'Av. And as the Rebbe said, the Chos B'Yosef, so saying the Holocaust, and every opportunity to give them the honor that the story will not be forgotten and shall live on. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And the books, I guess,